And welcome to this edition of In the Circle. I'm Eric Lopez. Victor Anderson will join us later. He's getting ready for his trip to Rosemont for the final week of Athletes Unlimited. But have no fear, joining us right now, celebrating her 100th episode as host of Bleav in Softball, former Stanford Cardinal great, nominated on X-Rating Softball for a breakout star analyst on Pac-12 Network. Jenna Becerra is joining us here at In the Circle. How you doing?
I'm great. See, I'm used to being the one who does the intros for people, and I forgot how uncomfortable it is when you're on the receiving end.
Well, now you know it's your shoe. Let's begin. We're going to talk obviously on this episode. We're going to have your thoughts on Athletes Unlimited. We just finished watching as we're recording this their final games of the weekend. They're down to their last week in the season. That's why one of the reasons why Victor's going up there next week. We'll have coverage live from Rosemont next week on the podcast and perhaps as well from Rosemont in person live. But you've talked to some of the players and athletes. We're going to talk about that, some of the offseason thoughts. But I want to begin because you just had your 100th episode. You had Dot Richardson came out. First of all, tell the audience about the show, where they could find it, because you've got a lot of content every week. With Dot Richardson, who's not the easiest to get. I've had her on the show. Pretty cool to have her on as your 100th episode guest.
Yes. Well, I'll get into Dot. But yeah, first, yes, thank you for having me. It's super exciting to hit 100 episodes. Like you said, it's Bleav in Softball with the Bleav Network. You can get it on any major platform that you usually get your podcast, and YouTube as well. You can follow us at Bleav in Softball on Instagram and Twitter, and that's Bleav spelled Bleav. But yes, it's pretty crazy, Eric, because I think back to when the podcast started, which was the beginning of the 2020 season, which everybody knows was sort of the beginning of the end with the apocalypse that ended up happening. It felt like that year, and a lot of softball was canceled. But I do like to tell people, I felt like during COVID, not just softball, but just in general, anyone and everyone was creating a podcast and like starting to use Zoom for the first time. I did feel cool that like I technically started doing that before COVID hit. And, I was editing and doing everything for the show the first year. And then the second season last year ended up getting more great guests, more listeners, which was awesome. But then adding the YouTube part, adding the social media channels. And then here's season 3, and it's the 100th episode of the show. And for me, and if people tune into the episode, Dot Richardson it was a personal tie there. She was number one, as anyone who knows who she is knows. That was me too. I played shortstop growing up, just like her, from Southern California. She played for UCLA, and just watching the USA team, and just thinking about the impact that she has had on the sport. Like the people that my generation looks up to, they look up to her, so it was a short list of people that I felt like would be right for the 100th episode. And she was up near the top. So I was thrilled to be able to get her. And I do still have a signed ball from her as well from when I was a kid. So.
Oh, wow. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
I'm just glad you were able to have her on, because then she gets going. As you know, she gets going. Once she gets going, you can't stop recording. So you got to be ready to clear the day. Has great stories on that. We've had you on before to discuss kind of your path. But for those that may not have missed that, tell us how you ended up hosting this show. How did that idea come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you said it. I played softball at Stanford. And I think I stayed an extra year to finish my master's degree at Stanford. And during that time, that's when I sort of got involved with sports broadcasting and actually covering sports rather than just playing them. And it did start with softball, obviously natural area to start in, a little bit of baseball as well. But I did cover the football team too, just for the Stanford Athletics YouTube channel. Eventually did radio coverage for both softball and baseball that year, and continued for a little bit afterwards. And then a few years ago, I think it was the 2019 season, really came back to it more full force in covering the broadcasts for Stanford Athletics, but then also Pac-12 Network came along not too long after that. And I think for me, the podcast came up. It's ironic because in between everything I just mentioned, I actually worked for LinkedIn for a while. Having gone to school in Silicon Valley, a lot of people go into tech. I did that for a while too. And I saw a job post from Bleav Network for being a podcast host. And something that I had been thinking about was some sort of recurring content series. I love content. I like consuming it. I think we all like the storytelling aspect of it, and having lived it too, at least parts of this game at that level in college, and knowing so many people that have crossed paths with me throughout my life, I wanted to start sharing that. And I think it was also this drive to somehow, even if it was a small light that I was shining on just a little show that I was starting up, shine some sort of light more on women's sports and just empowering women in that way. And not only women, but also the male allies like yourself, like Victor, who also support us. And so I ended up reaching out, and I went through the short process with Bleav, and pitched a few different shows. Actually, you'd be surprised, Eric. I know we've talked very briefly, but not in depth, about the WWE fandom that we both have, and that I've tried out to be a wrestler, which could be a totally separate podcast episode, but that did happen. But I actually pitched certain things like that too, and they were like, "Well, listen, you were a softball player. That makes the most sense." I was like, "You're right." So then ended up just kicking off Bleav in Softball, and I was supposed to initially co-host with Natasha Watley, which in and of itself was like a surreal moment for me. She couldn't end up doing it because she, as we all know, does 1,000 different things, but then she was one of my first guests on the show. So it was just a cool way to sort of transition into that. And it ended up being an outlet for me, just like I hope it was for everyone else during the crazy time that's been the last couple of years.
I didn't know about the Watley part. That's a wild. It's we have talked about the WWE stuff, which is funny. I mean, I've got guest ideas for you because there's coaches in the industry that like follow the WWE stuff. It's kind of interesting. How do you feel you've changed in the present to compared to when you first did the first couple of episodes?
It actually reminded me a little bit of the change that you go through in college, meaning my senior year, I was a very different person than I was my freshman year. And I feel that maybe not quite as a dramatic way, but a little bit with the show from the very beginning till now. I mean, even just confidence and things like that. I don't know if you feel the same way, Eric, but sometimes I look back at early episodes and I cringe a little bit because it's also weird to hear yourself talk, right? It's just like an awkward thing. So I feel just like more confident and things like that. But I think it's opened me up, I think, in terms of relationships. It's something that over the years and after college that I've thought about a lot, which is just how important relationships are, building those, nurturing those. And it sounds funny, but it's like little things like, of course, having gone to Stanford, you hate Cal, quote unquote. Like that's the rival. Those are the people that it's beat Cal at big game every year, that sort of stuff. And even just other Pac-12 rivals, let's say. But then you get to know the people, I think, off the field. And I have consistently, it's funny, I tell Chelsea Spencer, the head coach at Cal, I'm like, you're one of my favorite Cal people. This is so weird. I didn't know if I'd like someone from Cal. Right. I told Kate Scott the same thing, I mean, it's just a weird thing in a great way. Same goes for like Arizona people I've interviewed, like Callista Balco. I told this too as well. And, I think just opening up, I don't know, opening your mind a little bit in that sense has been really cool for me. And then of course I've learned new skills too, like how to actually produce a podcast and everything that goes into it. Like that skill building has been great. But I think for me, the thing I didn't anticipate that's been probably the best part is the relationships. And I feel like I've genuinely made new friends, even with people I played against, or even people that I've known since I was little, like a kid, but I actually got to get to know them again a little better, maybe as an adult. And so I think the relationship part is the biggest thing.
A relationship's a great word, because that has definitely been the thing that's jumped out to me on our show. And I'm wondering if it's done the same with you from this aspect of it is I talk to a lot of coaches that I'm covering. So obviously I do UCF games, but I'll see them cross play UCF. They know who I am. So there's that comfort level. Hey, yeah, I didn't know you did UCF games, or the other way around. And as a result, they are tending to be more open with me. As a result, it helps me from a broadcast standpoint because of that trust to produce a better broadcast on the air when I do the games for ESPN Plus. Have you gotten that sense that it's helped you as far as doing the Pac-12 games because you're having a lot of these coaches, so there's that relationship that might be harder for somebody from the outside because of the show.
1,000%. Like that is the short answer for sure. Um, yes. And it's kind of fueled both ways too. Like I actually worked with Chelsea Spencer, the example I gave earlier, first for Pac-12 Network, and then was like, she's so cool, I have to have her on the show, and then did it. But then the other way around as well. And then you only continue to strengthen those relationships as well. And there'll be times where I'm like in the middle of introducing myself maybe to some coach that I'm interviewing as well. And they're like, no, I know who you are. I like your show. It's great. I'm like, wait, really? And you kind of forget that, hey, you're so, I don't know, your head's so down and just focused, sort of tunnel vision, trying to do all these things that you're like, oh yeah. And it's weird because to me, everybody that I interview, the reason I'm excited to talk with them is because of the impact that they're making. And sometimes, and I'm trying to get better at like accepting compliments, I guess. But sometimes when they mention, Dot Richardson, for example, emailed me after everything went live. And she's like, thank you so much for what you do. And I'm like, thank me. Are you serious? You're the one who's done like all this
Sure.
for women and for sports and for everything, but, and then you sort of stop and think, and you're like, oh, maybe this is helping, even if it's in a small way, and so with that being said, I think that energy does translate over to the broadcasts and just other parts of the work, and it does make it better. And I do think, and I've said this before, but we're biased, but people do tend to agree. Like, I think there's something special about softball specifically with that, even more. I think it's sports is special in general, but for some reason, softball is just extra special. And when I had Rhonda Revelle, the head coach of Nebraska, on the show, she was like, no, I think you're right, because she's talked to other coaches at Nebraska from other sports. And she's like, no, they even say like softball special.
I agree with that. Is there anything that has surprised you about the show that because I'm sure you felt when we me and Victor started doing the show, we had no idea that we would be doing this year round. At the time when we first started, we just did it during the softball season. And even a full disclosure, we were planning on taking some time off this summer. But our numbers have been really we've had record numbers this year. Like we just had our best July since 2018. We're on track for the best month since August since 2018. We've been listened to in 38 countries, which is kind of mind-boggling. I mean, this is the access to stuff that I have. So that could be good and bad because you don't do it thinking, oh, I want to do it because it's numbers-wise. But clearly there's interest. People are listening to the show. Is there anything that has surprised you about the first 100 shows when you first started? Did you, what expectations, anything like that?
Yeah, I would say a little bit similar to what you mentioned. First of all, the fact that people listen, it still blows my mind to a certain degree. I'm like, wait, so people care. And sometimes it's like, that there are those people who are the first ones to download and to listen every single week. And you see how quickly people do that. And you're like, wow, they've actually been looking forward to this. And mostly I think it's like the guests, obviously, but the fact that they would even bother to listen to me talk is still, a humbling thing. But yes, I've seen some of the same things where I'm like, really, that country listens to me that much? Like, it's not just the US, there's like Canada, Australia, even like the UK, and a little bit in Japan, and just some in Europe. And it's crazy. I mean, it's really, really cool, because I think we talk about how global this sport really is and how women's sports really are, but to see it actually reflected a little bit in that way, even for something that's, to me, it's like, this is still early stages growing this thing, is pretty cool. So I think, yeah, that part has been really, really interesting.
Do you mute out it's interesting too, because with that, as we grow audiences, you're not, there's going to be people that disagree with what you might say. Like that's happened to us. It happened to us recently with some of the comments we made about Oklahoma and the transfers. Is this good for softball? Some of the Oklahoma fans got mad. I think they kind of misunderstood it. So we had to clarify some things. But in a way, that's kind of good that you have arrived, and this goes with broadcasting too. It's all subjective, so you're never going to have 100% approval rating, but you're getting feedback. So how do you handle the feedback? Because feedback at the end, we all want feedback, because the opposite of feedback is apathy, and that doesn't help, sense that. So I'm curious how you've handled. You had a great episode with Francesca there talking about that subject, about from a broadcasting standpoint of that feedback, knowing that, I think you both even joked you've arrived when you've got criticism on Twitter, right? Like, so just kind of discuss that from a podcast standpoint and as well as being on the air on the broadcast.
Yes. Well, the fact that there is feedback, to your point, is the most important, because it makes me think of, we're athletes, first of all. It's like we want, like when Francesca and I were talking about it, we want feedback. We're always trying to get better. Feedback's a way to do that. It's like with a coach, if they're on you all the time, that's not a bad thing. It's a bad thing when they stop talking to you, or when they stop paying attention to you, or pushing you, right? That's when they've maybe, or it feels like they're not as invested, or maybe they don't believe in you as much. So if people are giving you feedback, that's a good thing. I would say yes. So I did have my first hater on Twitter this past season. It was for a broadcast, not the podcast. And I, at first, it's hard to not be like, oh, it just like kind of gets you in the heart. And then it's like, of course, they have like 3 followers, like no profile photo, like the usual when it comes to the online trolls and things like that. And I remember texting Kate Scott, actually, and I was like, I think this means that I might be on my way to making it. And she was like, yes, that is exactly what it means. So yes, that is something where I think you just have to take it in stride. I would say the most important thing is that the conversation's happening. The fact that Oklahoma fans were upset with you guys, means that they're talking about women's sports. They're talking about softball, which is the whole point of what we do in the first place. So I think it's just taking it in stride. I would say, like, listen, now if it's like straight up trolls coming after you, like maybe block some of that noise out. But with feedback, it's like, take it in and then do with it what seems right for you, right? But like, I just think that the most important thing is the fact that they even care, because that's what we want.
Right, but that's a great sign, is that people are passionate enough to the point where people are reaching out to you. It's like you've reached a certain demographic, you've reached people. And that's okay if people disagree. I think that's the other thing that, not just softball, but in general, I think people kind of, I wish we could kind of just accept that, hey, it's okay to disagree. Like, I don't think it's the end of the world that everybody has to be on the same page on certain things. It doesn't mean anything negative there. What episode or interview, however you want to describe it, what was the episode or moment where you felt, yeah, I really like what I'm doing, I'm in this for the long haul? Because it could have gone a different way, right? You enjoy the podcast, maybe you feel like, this is too much work, maybe this is, I just don't I don't feel it. But obviously that wasn't the case. So when was it where you felt, okay, I really liked what I'm doing here, and I want to do this here long term here and get to now 100 episodes?
It's a good question, because full honesty, and I know you can relate, anyone who creates anything, I think, can relate to this, which is, sometimes you're like, why am I doing this? Like, if you're super burnt out and it starts to wear on you a little bit. And but I've noticed that anytime that thought or that feeling has kind of crept in, something happens to pull me out of it immediately. I'll randomly get a message from a listener, like a paragraph of how much they like the show, or something from one of my past guests, or something to show like, wow, okay, people care. I remember I felt that way during the first season, and then the local newspaper from where I'm from, which is Ventura County, the Acorn, reached out and they wanted to feature it in one of their articles that week. And I was like, okay, and it's not that it's not the attention necessarily. It's more just, oh, okay, so people care, and they want it. So it's like, I'm not just doing this for me, right? Like, the whole point was really to do it for them. And when I've had moments in terms of interviews, I don't know if it's one particular, but there have almost been like tent poles sort of throughout the time that have stuck with me. The first moment that I had just that surreal feeling of, whoa, this is actually really, really cool. I never could have guessed when I was 10 that I would be doing this, was when I interviewed Natasha Watley. That was the 4th episode ever of Bleav in Softball. I had interviewed former teammates and my former coach from Stanford before that. And then you fast forward, and there are those moments that pop up, like I said, of like, wow, I used to play against this person, or I used to compete against the school that they went to. And you just have that moment where you're like, I kind of like them though, but another moment was actually after Athletes Unlimited. That first season, it was the first season for Athletes Unlimited and the first for Bleav in Softball. And I interviewed Kat Osterman. And I think just the knowledge that everybody shares, I'm also blown away. And she's done a million of those, right? But by I think it takes a certain, I don't know what the word is necessarily, but definitely vulnerability, maybe a little bit of toughness, maybe a little bit of like gumption, I don't know, for these people to share their stories, their thoughts, their insights in a public forum like this. And so when people put that trust in you
Yes.
as the person to sort of shepherd that story, that's a really cool feeling. And I felt that a lot when Aubrey Monroe came on the show earlier this season, and it was the first time that she had actually talked about her retirement in a public forum. And I was like, wow, she doesn't even really know me. I mean, she knows that some of people she's very close with have trusted me in the past, but she was able to feel comfortable enough to do that and allow Bleav in Softball to be the forum for that. So there have been just kind of those like moments throughout the time that really stick out to me the most.
Yeah, I mean, and that's part of it. Is you want them to feel comfortable and open up, in the interview. You don't want a bunch of cliches. You want them to open up. You mentioned you had Aubrey, remember, right after she retired, talking at length for the first time about it. Another one I remember is you had Mike Condrea right after he had retired.
Yeah.
You were the first full length interview about it. He did the press conference, but that's different than a extensive interview that you did. You were the first, and you've done a lot of that first stuff there. And I know in getting to know you, you worked really hard. Like I remember it was during the championship series. I reached out to you. It's like I got to worry about like my thoughts. I got to gather my thoughts, and I show him like, yeah, I can relate to that. So
Yeah.
take me through the thinking of, and this is kind of behind baseball stuff for the audience a little bit, but your vision of, hey, I would like to get this person on this week and that process, because as you know, sometimes it's not easy. It doesn't go as planned. Sometimes you have to adjust to the maybe the guest schedule or the subject. So
Yep.
just take me through all that process for you. How has that gone for you, and what have you learned from that process?
Yeah, and it's essentially talent booking, which is not something I ever in my head was like, yes, that's something that I'm going to take on or that I'm going to do, but it's a natural part of this process that we do for these shows. And you're right, it's like you can't control people's schedules. There's a lot of coordinating that goes into it, and it just sort of is what it is. But I would say, this is a little cheesy, but maybe you approach it like you do or like I did with softball, which is you just do everything in your own power, and do the best that you can and let the chips fall where they may. But when it comes to timing, of course, there are certain things going on that are super relevant. Like, yes, Mike Kendria had just retired. He had his moment at the Women's College World Series. It's like, well, I would love to talk to that person. There's also an element of being brave enough to ask, because sometimes we might assume, and this isn't just for this is kind of in life, you assume, oh, there's no way, like they're not going to say yes, or they're way too busy, or they're this or that. And I just kind of blocked that out at times, and I just asked Mike Kendra and he said yes, and it's like, oh wow, so it really is the you miss 100% of the shots you don't take kind of
Yeah,
situation.
right.
Like the cliches kind of make sense in those moments. And so for things like that, it makes a lot of sense. Obviously Kat, I talked to her right after she won Athletes Unlimited the first time. Like that obviously makes sense. I think, during the college season, you talk to a lot of college folks, pro in the summer, Athletes Unlimited in the summer, some international stuff when things are happening. For me, it had to do with like figuring out the first few episodes of the show. I was trying to figure out the structure too.
Yeah.
Like what is this really going to look like? And I knew I wanted it to be interview based, but I also knew that there was room for maybe a little bit more. So that's where the sort of intro segment of covering our bases comes in, because it is really about current events, and that's the timing of every week of people are going to want to know, well, wow, this huge thing happened. Like, hey, what are the thoughts? Like, what are the basics that I should know? And then there's an element of I wanted also people to feel like they were learning, and almost not that I'm some huge expert that knows everything in life, but to share what I was learning, I guess, which is how the foul tip of the week segment, which was like sort of the outro segment, was born. And a lot of times that's inspired by whatever conversation I had recently and the guests that were on the show. And I think figuring that out, like knowing that I wanted those elements, as well as the interviews, which are sometimes maybe timely, like with Laura Berg, who's a freaking legend.
Yeah.
The timing of it was around the 50th anniversary of Title IX. So of course we're going to talk about that and just her impact on everything. But in some ways too, some of these interviews are actually really evergreen. Like you could go back and listen to them at any
Yes.
time and it would feel relevant. And that's kind of the angle that I wanted. I also knew that I wanted people from all kinds of different backgrounds and areas of softball, different conferences, coaches, players, media people. Like that's why you've been on. Kayla Lombardo from Softball America has been on. Like other folks have been on the show to talk through that. And even just like business leaders like Sherry Kempf, who's running things at Athletes Unlimited, and just understanding that. I'd love to have umpires on the show at some point. I think we desperately need their perspective.
I've been trying. It's not
right?
easy. Yeah.
It's not easy. Well, because it's tough. They're criticized enough. Do they want to come on a forum like this and talk through it more? And you don't blame them. So you're also managing all kinds of things like that. But I think that's where the relationship part that we talked about already is so, so important. And people can see that, I think. And it makes them want to say yes. The more relationships you build, they're like, oh, wow, like those are really good people. And they seem to have a relationship here. So maybe I should say yes too.
One of the, I know when last time we had you on, one of your goals was to get Jessica Mendoza on the show. You accomplished that.
Yes.
You have this over me. This is where you get to brag. You've had Ramona Shelburne on the show. I have not. I've tried.
Yeah.
That's the one that's bugging me. Like when I remember when you announced that you had her, I'm like, I yelled. I did. I'm not gonna lie, because I covered the NBA, so I'm like, I can relate.
Right.
I really am fast because Ramona does the NBA but plays softball, so that's the one. So you now crossed off Mendoza. First of all, what was that like, real quick? Because I know that was a goal, because she's one of your idols in a lot of ways. Why you're doing media, why you're doing broadcast, because of her. What was it like to finally get her?
It was awesome. And luckily for me, I had some moments with these like huge people who have made such a big impact, like Natasha Watley, like some other folks, Stacey Newman, these huge people in the softball world. So that nervousness, and I talked to a couple guests about this, like Ashley Burkhart was on the show, and she's a podcast host as well. And we talked about how it almost feels like game day, when you're preparing for some of those interviews. And so I was lucky that I had some of that under my belt already, and that there is a personal relationship to a certain degree there with her. We're from the same hometown. We're both Stanford alums. We've spent some time in just that alumni capacity together and have that connection. So there was common ground right off the bat. But the fact that it was able to actually happen, and that's actually an example, Eric, where I just hadn't asked. I hadn't even asked. I'm like, oh, I really want to do that. I really want to do that. But I would think, oh, well, she's in the middle of baseball season or this or that. And then I finally was just like, hey, let's do it. And then it worked out where it's like, let's open up season 3 with her. So it was really, really cool. And Ramona's similar thing with the Stanford connection and everything, and that personal relationship. Definitely took extra coordinating with those two, I will say. And they know that, because they are so busy, but it finally worked.
Both are great. And Mendoza's always been great on this show. She's the one that I'm always like, to your point. It's funny. I've interviewed tons of guests, and I don't know if you have one or two that jumps out like this, but there's that. Jessica's one of those where I'm like always nervous, and like I'm over preparing for the interview because I want to make sure everything goes perfect, because she has a lot on her schedule, and mentally that kind of messes with you. Have you had a guest or two where you're like, okay, I'm a little nervous on this one more than others, just because I want to make sure you're overthinking it? Realize what it is.
Oh, well, I'm an overthinker in general. So yes. But then at the same time, again, a little cheesy, but I think back to like my best softball is always played when I stopped overthinking. So I try to do that as well. But yeah, you definitely, like before Dot, I was like, this is one of the most important interviews I've ever done.
Yeah.
Right now, that's about to happen. So you definitely want to be prepared. I am always about preparation. That is how I feel comfortable. I'm getting better at sort of just letting certain things flow. And that's been actually something huge that I've learned, which is, conversations can go in all kinds of directions. You might not ask every single question on your list to ask this person, but just let it flow, let it be natural. And so, but for me, I like the preparation and then allow everything to kind of just flow how it should. But there are some people like that. I think the first time when I interviewed Kat and when I interviewed Monica Abbott as well, I definitely felt that those were both in the first season too. No, so I was like, oh, and right. And it's like and it was like those two, Natasha, all of them in the first season. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so new to this, but you do have this feeling of you want to respect their time, right? Because that they don't have a ton. And the fact that they're giving some to you is a privilege. So you do want to do that. But I think as long as you approach it in that way, which is to just prepare and do all you can and be very respectful and everything, they've always been super receptive.
Who's the next guest that Mendoza? You crossed off the list. Because I remember you told me that was the one you're hoping to get. Now that
Yeah.
because there's always like I already mentioned it. Ramona's the one that
Yeah.
I'm trying to get that I haven't had on the show. We've done like a lot of episodes. Who's the next one on your list?
Yeah. I think Dot was, and then now that was checked off, I think it's got to be Lisa Fernandez.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I would say I think and that one there has been communication there, but she's the only person I've ever been starstruck. The only time I've ever been starstruck in my life was when I was around 10 and I actually met Lisa at like a UCLA alumni game, and they had a clinic and stuff like that. And I got to meet her when I was there to watch the game. And so I think going from that to then I played obviously against UCLA in college, and she was over there, on the coaching staff. And I've always been, and anyone who listens to the show knows, like I was a pitcher who hit or a hitter who pitches, however you want to say it, growing up. And so I love that in general. And she was not just the face of that, but she's the GOAT, So I do think that would probably be the next one.
That's a good one. I've had her once. She was fantastic. Not the easy, but again, this is one of those where a lot of behind the scenes work there is there. Where do you want to take the show next? Like we're always tinkering, right? We're always tinkering. What do you want to do for the next 100 or however many more episodes? What's the next step for you that you want to do you haven't done with the show yet that you think?
Yeah, I think I'm still figuring that out, because every season I have that reflection, just like you would in any season I ever played. You sort of have that reflection back on it and like, okay, well, what do we want to do from here? And progress is very important to me. I think anytime that we feel stagnant or stuck, that's the worst feeling. And I know on Stanford's campus, actually, I used to make fun of this in the beginning, but I've started to understand it more over the years. Coach Harbaugh at the time had a huge sign put up on the football practice field, which was right next to our locker room, the softball team's locker room at the time. And it said, "You're either getting better, or you're getting worse. You never stay the same," which I think has some truth to it. But whenever you have that feeling of like, oh, things are just staying the same, that kind of like gets at you the most, in my opinion. So with that being said, like the social media aspect, the bringing it to YouTube, those things were very important to me. I think this year, just expanding on what the show is. I think distribution is something, and maybe even crossing over a little bit outside of just softball, which we've done a tiny bit, but I think there's more room for it, especially within the world of women's sports. And I just want to look at how we can reach an even bigger audience, which will take some skill building too, and just learning how to do that, like how to get in front of more people. But I'm still figuring out like what exactly, other than more listeners and things like that, are the goals.
Yes. Now clearly we both like talking, and we like talking to each other. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna take a break and bring you back, because coming up, I'm gonna ask you about your broadcasting season, which was nominated you were nominated for Breakout Star by Extra Innings Softball. You had a unique year from a broadcasting standpoint because you did not only color but play-by-play. So I want to give you thoughts on that. Plus, season 3 of Athletes Unlimited is wrapping up. I want your thoughts on that, as well as some of the quick thoughts on the off season. That's Jenna Becerra filling in as the co-host. Hey, Victor, feel free to just, we got it covered. He's getting ready to go out there to Rosemont for a live show, doing shows from over there in the circle. This is In the Circle